welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. And last, but certainly not least, if you're interested in extra content on querying and publishing that's only for our members, please consider joining the Literary Prospects Patreon at patreon.com/literary prospects. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. Roohi Choudhry was born in Pakistan and grew up in Southern Africa. She holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Michigan and is the recipient of a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship and residencies at Hedgebrook and Djerassi. She worked as a researcher in criminal justice reform and public health, wrote for the United Nations, and facilitates creative writing workshops for community organizations. Her stories and essays have appeared in Plowshares, Callaloo, Long Reads, and the Kenyon Review. Her debut novel, Outside Women, is out now. Roohi Choudhry, thank you so much for being here today to talk about your extraordinary debut novel, Outside Women. Publishers Weekly says Choudhry debuts with a riveting dual narrative of two South Asian women faced with similar moral dilemmas a century apart. As the two women seek the courage to speak up, the novel keenly portrays the power of female solidarity. The result is an incisive story of how change happens. Forward Reviews says Outside Women is a gripping historical novel that contrasts the abuses of patriarchy and misogyny with the power of women to stand for freedom, truth, and justice. This complex, nuanced story rises above its graphic descriptions of torture inflicted on those who dare to defy conventions, to celebrate the strength of women and the warmth of human friendship and loyalty. Author Lisa Coe says combining the reach of a historical saga with the propulsion of a mystery, Roohi Choudhry's tightly woven debut illustrates the power of sisterhood, legacy, and solidarity through the unforgettable stories of two defiant women living a century apart. And one more, author Peter Ho Davies says Outside Women is a powerful and beautifully braided novel of personal and political history. Choudhry traverses continents and centuries with conviction and subtlety in this striking debut. So, with that, what can you tell us about Outside Women?
Thank you so much, Kelley. This is really lovely to be in conversation with you. And it's one of the first conversations I'm having about the book, so that's really special too. Yeah, what can I tell you about the book? It's a book I worked on for a lot of years, like a lot of my adult life. I first started kind of scribbling away at it almost 15 years ago. And it's rooted though, even before that, like when I was a young person, I was originally from Pakistan, but my family moved around Southern Africa as I was growing up. So we moved to Durban, South Africa, where much of the book is set when I was 13. And it was just like a really mind-opening and confusing experience, at that age, because it was just at the cusp of the end of apartheid in South Africa. And I had been used to like being in international schools because of my parents moving around so much and being with a lot of different kinds of people. And suddenly I was in what was known as an Indians only school. And so it was a really jarring experience, but then in some ways very beautiful to see this community there and for all the questions that people had because there were so few people coming from other countries to South Africa at the time.
Mm,
So many people there who were descended from South Asians who had migrated and been brought there so many generations before, they didn't get a chance often to meet other South Asians from South Asia at the time. Lots has changed now.
mm,
But at the time, it was still novel. And so there was a lot of exchange and questions and just new stuff. And I just became really fascinated with the community there and really just, that was where that obsession began. So the novel kind of brings together that obsession with other obsessions, because of my own life of moving around. For me, migration has never been like a linear story. It's
mm,
never been like leaving one place to go to another. It's always been these, what I think of as like crisscrossing diasporas. So there's all these different diasporas, in my experience, diasporas from South Asia, but then also interlinking with others. And, I was just really interested always in how those migrations from the past continue to kind of resonate and live on and breathe on in the places where we live.
mm.
And the book was really to channel a lot of those ideas. So it was not a straightforward narrative to try to get right, to bring together these complex stories, and there were many doubts along the way of like whether that was the right move. But I felt so strongly that my story, the story that I was supposed to kind of um put myself into and put years into, was not one person's story, or was not one narrative, one linear narrative. The book intertwines two narratives, which you mentioned a little bit of in your intro, and they're both migrant women, but they're separated by time and mostly space, although the space kind of comes together. And they both have the same decision to make, whether to risk their own lives to fight for someone else. And so it sort of becomes about how finding new homes and new kinship is about that sense of standing up for someone else and solidarity with others.
You said it's been a long time in the making. What was the spark that got this particular story, the stories of these two particular characters, these two particular women, started for you?
Hmm. Yeah, I think the first spark was Sita, which is the historical part of the book, the historical character. She leaves India in the late 1800s. Um, and and so that historical part of it was the first spark. And I believe I first started kind of meeting her when I had a writing residency at a place called Hedgebrook on the West Coast, which is a residency. Their tagline is Women Authoring Change. So it felt very apropos of the kind of ideas I was approaching, and I was inspired to be there. And it was also one of the first times that I had had that experience of someone taking my writing seriously, because I had not gone to school for that at the time. I had not, even taken any classes or anything. So it was just a really transformative moment. And in that moment is when I started to kind of meet this character, and pull together some of the interest that I'd had for so long. But it took a lot longer for me to get to Hajra. Like I did that little bit of scribbling, then I went to do an MFA actually later. And towards the end of my MFA, I had a thesis to pull together. I was like, oh yeah, I had this character, Sita. Let me see what's happening here. And I had a completely different character who was like the other one, and it just wasn't working. And so it was around that time that I threw away most of what I had written,
Oh,
and
wow.
started again at that point, which was its own thing. But yeah, and that's when I sort of chanced upon this character, Hajra. I really felt at the time, and it was starting to become clear that this other character, and I was clear that there needed to be two, but it only slowly became clear that the other character needed to have a strong enough arc of her own and enough kind of struggle of her own, and not just that she was you know, someone pursuing a different story, and
Mhm.
that she needed to have her own kind of inciting moment. And
Mhm.
also I realized at that point that she, like Sita, needed to be someone who leaves like the country where she's born, and that she's not someone who's already in diaspora.
Mhm.
So those were some of the things that were going into that, but as I'm sure you're familiar, it's a little bit of a kind of magical process too of like how these people come to us. But yeah, that's some of the process.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about, you said you knew that there needed to be two. So I'm interested in how you knew that there needed to be two. And then in accomplishing this braiding of the two narratives as you're working out the structure, because it's quite complicated. We have Hadra's story starting in present day New York, winding back through Pakistan and South Africa. And then, as you said, we have Sita, who is 1891 in British India, is where her story starts. And so, how did you work with accomplishing this braiding and figuring out where to get in to each narrative and then when to weave back and forth?
It was really hard. Probably the hardest thing of all. And what was additionally hard and related was just that what you mentioned, like knowing that there needed to be two, because I doubted that a lot, even though I felt confident in it in some ways. But then in terms of messages I would get, like from workshops that I was in along the way, it always seemed like I was making it so hard on myself,
Yeah.
And so then I would wonder, like, is this, but then I would return to the place of I'm really confident in this in a deeper way. And so why I felt that confidence is a little bit rooted in what I mentioned earlier of like this was my life, like
Mhm.
knowing that there are these past migrations around us is not just about the past, it's about the present too. And it's about how those are linking together, and also how in the present, especially as immigrant women, we are able to kind of look to not just our own like biological lineage, but also the lineage of other women migrants who've done this on their own, and who have, fought against so many of the same struggles, that is a kind of lineage and ancestry. And that was a really important thing just for me as a person, for me as a writer, and it's something that I wanted to explore that I didn't feel like I was reading in my reading in the books around me.
Mhm.
Um, so I felt like, okay, this is hard, but it is what I really want to do. That is the reason I'm writing this book, is the kind of thought that came to me at one point, was like, it's not just about doing this tricky thing, but that is actually the question I'm trying to answer for myself, is why do these two stories need to be told together? And
Mhm.
how would that actually resonate for a reader and not be disruptive? And so both of those, like both from a thematic point of view and the craft point of view, were like the driving questions for me, and
Mhm.
the whole reason I was doing it. So it felt very important to get it right. And um, I often felt like I don't know how I'm going to get this right. And I think the where that shifted a little bit was a few years ago. There were two things that happened around the same time. One is that I showed the draft I had to a good friend, also novelist Nawaz Ahmed, really like master of like structure himself. And he looked at what I was doing at the time of braiding two stories. And
Mhm.
he was like, these are three stories, because there's like this present, or it's actually a few years in the past now, but more or less present day New York Hadra. There's the past Hadra as well, where she is growing up and kind of dealing with the family dynamics and her growing activism in Peshawar in Pakistan. And
Mhm.
then there's a historical story, which is a little bit more linear, of Sita growing up and then being pushed out of her home in India and
Mhm.
getting to South Africa. So he was like, these are actually three. You're trying to make them into two. And I thought that was interesting, and I was kind of um, processing that. And then I went to a conference, Breadloaf, in Vermont,
Mm,
and attended a talk there by Ingrid Rojas Contreras.
mm, mhm.
And she had this really fascinating approach to structure that stayed with me. And I'm sure she's written about this elsewhere, but the part that stayed with me was that for her own first book, for her novel, she used the guidance of an image for her structure. So she was not approaching it as much of a logistical or like kind of nuts and bolts kind of way. She was
Mm,
approaching it in a more instinctive and poetic way by having this kind of image of these. I think it was like a mirror image that she had, like of a person in a mirror. And she used that idea, the image of the mirror, to guide the structure. And that was really interesting.
mm,
So, the idea of the braid had always been with me, and
mm.
the image of like the plait of hair that South Asian women so often have is such a iconic image. And so that idea of the plait was with me, and I was like, if the plait is my guiding image, the braid, there are three strands in a braid,
Yeah.
you know.
Mm.
And so those two kind of observations are on the same time cemented to me that this is the way to kind of get to this place is of really treating these as three stories that have to be braided together. Um, and that led to like a lot more writing and stuff to make that work.
What did your process look like? Did you find that you were bouncing back and forth and working in each of the strands a little bit at a time, or did you tend to go more through one and then another? How did that all work out for you in the process?
I mean, there's so many drafts that went into this, so I'm trying to remember like I think there was a slightly different process with earlier drafts versus later drafts.
Yeah.
So in earlier drafts, it was a lot more of just going through almost chronologically.
Mm,
And and I felt like going chronologically was helpful to the writing process.
mm,
And, that even though that would shift later, I needed to write it that way.
mm,
So that was true for definitely the first draft and maybe more. Later, though, is a lot more, kind of breaking things apart and then seeing what needed to happen, putting these pieces together, and sometimes literally cutting up stuff and putting it together and things like that.
mm.
So it was a little bit less like linear then. And usually what I would do, like when I went through whether it was feedback from others or a reading myself and being like, I'm getting ready for a new draft, I would have a list, like a to-do list,
Yeah.
of like these are all the things that need to happen. And then sometimes it's like a multi-layered process of like going into those to-do items and thinking, okay, this, for example, this two stories needs to be three. How do I do that? And then breaking that down a little bit more, going through and being like, this section needs to, I need to add more writing here. And then I would basically go through to-do list item by to-do list item, And sometimes it was like there was years when I was working full time and I only had my lunch break. So then I would have that one to-do list item for that day on my lunch break in a notebook in a corner,
Um,
So there's a lot of like piecing things together.
I love the title, Outside Women, and it's a specific term that's used in the book. Can you talk about the term outside women and what it means to you?
Yeah. Um, it's a term that's sort of emerged in the writing, so it's not something that I'm hearing a lot of, but I like to say that I hear it everywhere,
Mhm.
once I felt like I had language for what I was trying to say. So, I mean, outside women, I guess in the most straightforward way that I think about in my mind, um, are women who have been pushed out of the institutions where power lies, whether that's just the family or larger institutions, um, colonial institutions, government, everything, from the smallest level to the largest level. It's women who are pushed out of those institutions of power and then have to find their own way and agency outside of that. And I think of it as a multi-layered um, kind of phenomenon because even though being pushed outside or being ostracized or being outsidered is a dangerous and difficult and painful thing, I feel like there's a lot of power on the outside because a lot of those institutions are pretty messed up to begin with.
Mhm.
So even though we want the protection of those institutions, whether that's just from like family even, when that isn't possible, then there's something new that can come up, and new bonds and new ways of thinking that can come about. So I think of the outside also as a sense of what's wild and true, outside of kind of the usual structures. And I was really influenced by a book called Women Who Run with the Wolves by
Yeah.
Clarissa
Mhm.
Colestis. Yeah, it's a classic, and I've always loved it. And I started thinking about it a little more when the phrase outside women and some of these things started to kind of coalesce for me. I returned to that book, and she really talks about women having this wildishness, this original state that we are then taken away from and that we can reclaim, if we like choose to accept that, kind of difficult demand. We can reclaim that state and, you know, reconnect with what I think of as the outside, and so the natural world and those kind of aspects of the outside were really important to me too. And it's just something, that I feel connected to as a person. So that's something I really tried to thread through this idea of just elements of the natural world, whether they're birds like on the cover or this tree that is a recurring motif. I wanted those to kind of be part of that outside as well. I hope that answers the question.
It does, yes.
Okay.
There are a lot of very emotional scenes in the novel, and your prose is very sensual. The reader is heavily immersed in the sensory details of the scene. And you've said that it was difficult for you as a writer experiencing some of these scenes so viscerally through your characters as you were writing. Is that right?
Mhm, definitely. Yeah.
And you had some writer friends who gave you some advice on how to get through writing some of the more emotional scenes. Can you share that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the pieces of advice that has probably come up before was pretty great craft advice. I've actually used it since then for other work too. There was one scene in particular which I won't give away, but just to reference for anyone who's read the book already, it's the scene on the plantation with Vasanthi, and and it was a scene that I'd been building up to. I knew because in my plans for the book that this is something that was a bit of a climactic moment that needed to happen and that I needed to kind of rest in. And I really believe that the moments and scenes that scare you the most are the ones where you have to spend the most time, like on the page, not just time writing, but also on the page and not like rush through them. So it felt like heavy to spend a lot of mental space there and do it justice. So this advice was, why don't you write it just like as if you're reporting on something as a journalist? And, instead of like this coming to it in the creative space, which requires so much more vulnerability and openness. Um, Instead, just like kind of focus on the facts, which are, obviously made
Mhm.
up, but the facts as I see them in my mind's eye. And that's what got me through writing that scene because I knew that I needed to describe it and really stay there, um, but that felt hard to do. So just writing it from a distance helped to get through it. And then I went through and kind of over time used some of my like fiction writing tools to make it, feel more like a scene.
I love that. It's such a good trick for an emotionally heavy scene, especially, but really for anything, it kind of seems like where you're feeling stuck, right? Just to kind of think about writing it, reporting what's happening in the scene, and then get through it in that way.
Yeah, I definitely believe in using tricks a lot, like because I do feel like most of the time I'm the one getting in my way, not because, on purpose, but because it's an emotional process and there are a lot of different kinds of internalized and learned barriers that we have, as writers that get in our way and then sometimes we can just stay there, like
Yeah.
we never really break out of those. So I feel like, all the tricks, give me all the tricks to get out of that space, whatever that hesitation might be.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the things that I actually have passed on many times, because I teach writing too, so I've
Mm.
passed it on to students, is this website called mostdangerouswritingapp.com, which I think the actual URL has changed, so I'll share that with you, but I think
Okay.
it still comes up in a Google search. But it's called Dangerous Writing. This person just came up with it where the website has a little window and you like kind of say start and the timer starts and you start typing. And if you stop typing for more than I think 5 seconds or 3 seconds, it all disappears. Um, I know every writer always has this moment of like, so it's like high
Wow.
stakes, like you got to keep typing. Only in like 5 minute increments. There's lots and lots of sections of this book that I've written like that. Because I just could not, felt like I was coming up against constraints in my mind or, other things that are happening in life that are then making me not want to write. But I feel like I don't think we should be like torturing ourselves, but I think if we feel really drawn to the writing and really want to write, but then feel like it's really hard to get past all those other kind of barriers, then those tricks can be great. And that really would help me break out of that thing of like, this has to be perfect right out of the gate, or it's not worth writing.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's great. I'm gonna try that, but I'm a little bit afraid.
Yeah, it's scary, but I think it's worth it when the time is right.
We talked about the emotional scenes in the novel. Um, but you are quick to point out that it is not just a novel of hardship, it's a novel of joy. And I wondered if you would talk about that a little bit.
Oh, thank you for asking about that. Um, yeah, and I really appreciate the question also because I feel like so many books by people of color, by immigrant writers, often, get into that category of kind of, um, you know, difficulty porn, if
Mhm.
like to use a strange word for it, sort of fetishizing almost. People sometimes fetishize those struggles, and it's as if like our lives just become about that. So I really struggled with that in my writing process, and especially in this lead up to the book's release, of like, is this how, it's going to be read? That, it's sort of like all of these awful things that are happening, and that's really what it's all about. And not that awful things don't happen to all of us, but that what I'm really more interested in the book is what we do with that, and how we kind of rise above it, but also really meet it, and like see what's happening and see what those struggles are all about and how they're interconnected, and then see that, people who might be quite different from us are still um, facing those same struggles and can have a sense of shared liberation and be joined in that. Um, One of the early titles for the book, which was the title for a long time, was The Land That Joins Them. And it's from a poem by Ursula Le Guin that I really loved. at some point, Outside Women seemed like the natural title, so it replaced that. But it's still a line that is in my mind and was in my mind a lot as I was writing. Like, what is the land that joins them? Joins these two characters, joins a lot of different characters, joins all of us. And in my mind, that was very much, it's actually that ground that you stand on right outside somebody else, right? Like
Mhm.
standing next to them, standing alongside, side by side, whatever terms you use for that, that's where the joy comes, like standing side by side with someone. And, it's not necessarily about saving them, but standing with them.
Mhm.
Um, and that's, really what um, is a sense of kinship and joining across time and space. So yeah, I think that's where some of the joy comes. The other one is I think the there's a photo at the very beginning of the book that really draws Hajra in and is a little bit of kind of spark for her search. And it's a photo of a woman laughing while protesting. So that was another way in which I felt that there's something really interesting, powerful about laughter and about laughing in the face of things like that because
Mhm.
that's just really like being human, and being in some ways an animal human because laughter is so essential and so primal. So I hope that some of those ideas are coming through alongside the hardships.
Yeah, they are. What was the road to publication like
Mm,
for you?
yeah, it was a tough road. Um, I worked on the book for so long without really approaching publication, not because I didn't want to, because I wanted it very much. And there's so much of that desire to kind of bring the work into the world and also I felt so much desire to have some external validation because it's always hard. And I know a lot of your listeners are writers, so it's always hard to keep laboring on an idea, no matter how much you believe in it, without that validation. I mean, we'd like to say that I don't need validation. I just believe in myself. Like, I think that's nice, but I think the reality is that we are trained and want, that validation. It's really hard to keep going without it.
Yeah.
And so there was many times I really wanted to just like send it out and even though it was an earlier draft. Um, but the advice I was given by like professors and so on was like really get it to as far as you can possibly get it,
Mhm.
before you get to that step. So that was an exercise in patience. But I thought once I got it to that point, which was many, many drafts in, I was like, okay, I've done that hard thing. I've been patient. I went for an MFA. I went to workshops. I did all this stuff.
Mhm.
Come back to me, world. Like take what I've written and that's it, right? That's how it's supposed to go. Well, apparently things don't always go the way they're supposed to go. So at that point I started looking for an agent and I had so many kind friends who had like referred me to their agents or people I'd met along the way at conferences and so on. And I was like, oh yeah, I have like a long list that I've been keeping. This will be easy. And it was not at all easy. And there were many people. I think the only thing that some of those connections helped with was that people would look at the manuscript,
Mhm.
which is already like in itself hard. But then I was not really getting, interest in pursuing the manuscript. And some of the comments and stuff were really disheartening. Um, so I just kind of kept looking, and I'm really glad I waited and found the agent I did because I think she's really the right agent for me. And that was another point where I was like, okay, I went through that. Now we're done. You
Uh-huh.
know? Now things are supposed to go a certain way. And it still didn't go that way. She sent out my book for like more than 18 months, and it was just no's along all over. And that was a surprise to her too, and she's fairly experienced. So I knew that it wasn't just me anymore. And there was nothing that we were getting back. I was like ready to be like, let's stop, let me go and revise. I'm happy to do that. But there was nothing that was really clear. So that was very hard. And, I want to say like it's not the worst thing that can happen to someone. Like there's so many things in the world. So I often would remind myself of that. But at the same time, it felt like such a difficult thing because so much of my identity was wrapped up in that. And, um, it was a real, like, in some ways, like an awakening of like, oh, I guess I had assumed that things are supposed to go a certain way. And why would that be true in writing when it's not true anywhere? And I really need to re-examine the assumptions that I've made about this process and about my work and what I'm entitled to. And I think in some ways, I mean, I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but it was what I needed to go through, to kind of ground myself in what I really care about, like work with my communities. I mean, I really kind of poured myself more into that work and into teaching and uplifting other people. And I think that, I found a different way to be that I feel like is holding me in good stead now because even though eventually I did find this press, University Press of Kentucky, it's still, a rocky road to publication. There's still so many surprises and disappointments and questions along the way. So I feel like that was a necessary like reckoning that is needed at any point in the process.
What has it been like working with a university press?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mixed bag because in some ways it's really wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I don't know any other way. This is my first book.
Mm-hmm.
But from what I hear from friends and so on, there's some real advantages like I'm not lost in a sea of literary writers at the press like I might be at a different publisher. They really, I think, have made every effort they can, for this book. I don't have to wait around to get an email. When I write an email to the publicist, I get an email back right away, Like, and I think that that's easy to take for granted, and that is not the experience I'm hearing that a lot of people have at bigger publishers. So there's some real advantages in that way. And there's a rigor also that comes from it. Like, they made the book go through peer review.
Mm-hmm.
We had like an expert in kind of literature of indenture read the book. There's
Oh,
certain
wow.
things that they're going through, which sometimes I think with a more commercial publisher, they might really like speed it through, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, they're more particular about some of those things. Um, so those are some advantages. There are disadvantages, which are probably somewhat obvious, is like, University Press is essentially a nonprofit, and they do not have the budget to push the book in the way that a commercial publisher could. And they don't also have, this is actually kind of more important in some ways, they don't have some of the connections, because they're focusing so much more on academic books. And then the kind of creative writing, poetry, prose are a smaller subset of what they're doing. It's not the same kind of connections with the literary world.
Mm-hmm.
And that is challenging, with getting the word out about the book. And I struggled with having to do a lot more of that on my own. Um, but it's been a bit of a crash course in some of that stuff, and I think that writers these days need to have that in their pockets no matter what their publisher is able to do for them. So it's possible that even at a different publisher, I would have had to do a lot of the same.
Yeah.
Um, but sometimes it can be frustrating to not have the budget to pay for events or, any of that stuff.
Have you always been a writer?
Much, yeah. I mean, I was a writer in my heart always, but as a profession, it wasn't my profession always. Um, my parents just really like didn't feel like that could be a stable enough job, and they were probably right looking at it now from my 40s. Like actually, they were probably right about that. So, they really wanted me to like go to school for something that was more of a direct path to like earning a living and so on. So I kind of was on that path. I got my bachelor's in economics. And then I did a master's in like market research. So I was on a very different path, and I was working in research, essentially like first market research and then I kind of switched quickly to the nonprofit side. And that was my profession for a long time, and I wrote only when I could squeeze some time out,
Mm.
And um, and then about 10 years ago, I went like kind of freelance, and that was what made it more possible to kind of mix together both like research work, writing work, and have a little bit more autonomy over my time, and feel like I could really just be a writer more of the time.
What is your writing routine like? Do you have a daily routine?
Uh, Not at the moment because my mind is it's so full of like publicity tasks. So I've decided to give myself like the grace of like, okay, I'll take a break. But normally over the years, I actually feel like the writing routine has to serve where we are in our lives,
Mhm.
um, rather than the other way around. Because there were many times where I would feel like, oh, I need to write in the morning or forget it. Like that's
Mhm.
how you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to get up at whatever, crack of dawn. And I would always feel bad when I would sleep in. So, and then I think I mentioned to you earlier about the lunch breaks. Like that was something that was serving
Yeah.
me at a certain period in time when I had a really demanding job and long commute,
Mhm.
and just felt like, where is the time, but I had like this lunch break because of the nature of the job that was always there, and so I was like, might as well use that. I'm fairly fresh at that time of day. And that worked really well. So I think the writing routine varies. Now that I'm freelance, I definitely try to do it in the mornings because then all the emails and stuff get in the way. But there are times when it has to be different.
What do you know now that you wish you had known before publishing your debut novel?
Before publishing, right? Not
Mhm.
before writing.
Before publishing.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do I know now? I think what I'm learning, and I'm at the very beginning of this learning,
Mhm.
but I'm trying to remember it, is that it's extremely unpredictable what this process is going to be like. And that doesn't have to be a negative. That can actually be something really lovely and beautiful. And I actually had a tarot reading because I love tarot. And I'm a member of this collective called Typewriter Tarot.
Oh,
And
cool.
yeah, I really recommend that. And so the person there, Cecily, who runs that, she was giving me this interpretation of a card for tarot lovers. It was the High Priestess that had come up for me. And she was kind of reminding me that, if in this process, and this goes for this stage of publication, but it can be for the earlier part of the process too. If we're so kind of fixated on pushing through and pushing our own vision of how this is supposed to go,
Mhm.
then it can be easy to lose sight of what is going to come that we could not predict or that is not in our hands, and that is some kind of magical alchemy that happens out there when people come across your words and when connections are made that you couldn't have expected, and that we shouldn't like lose sight of that. And so I've been trying to remember that, and that's something I really don't think I realized because I was so focused on pushing it through and working really hard and doing everything that I could do, that there's actually a lot that I could never like predict or imagine that is part of this story too.
Yeah, great. I know that you teach. We've talked about that. Do you have a favorite piece of advice for aspiring authors?
Mm, favorite piece of advice. Um, There's a lot of them. I think one of my favorite like craft pieces of advice that comes to my mind right now, and some of the process pieces of advice I think we've already touched on, like the tricks.
Yeah.
Um, those are some of my favorites. And just doing what you have to do when you can and not being so tied to a specific routine or but in terms of craft, one of my favorites came from my professor, Eileen Pollock.
Mm.
And I was really stuck on a short stories ending when I was working with her. And she gave me this advice that often with any kind of story, there are two possible kind of endings, right? That present themselves or seem obvious, like, it's a romance, like, will they get together? Will they not get together? Or
Mhm.
that sort of thing. And that the kind of more interesting and powerful ending is the third one, the one that is not the one that seems immediately apparent and is not that kind of binary choice. And instead, there's a third one that is the thing to look to and to kind of tease out. I found that like I've never stopped thinking about that. I think every time I've written something, I've always looked for that third ending. Um, and being aware of the temptation to choose one of the binary options.
Mhm. That is really cool. Now I'm not going to stop thinking about it.
Yeah, it's pretty great.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. Yeah, Eileen is an amazing teacher for sure.
We have a traditional last question for the podcast, and it is when Outside Women is made into a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
Oh, the theme song. Oh, interestingly, that's pretty easy because it's a song I listen to endlessly while writing. And it is actually from the soundtrack of a movie already, so maybe it wouldn't count, but it is from the soundtrack of a movie called Angry Indian Goddesses, um, from a few years ago. And this song is called Gatte, Kattey. I'll share it with you.
Okay.
It's a really powerful anthem-like feminist song,
Oh,
and it
cool.
blends like some folkloric singing with like hip hop in English,
Oh, cool.
by this rapper called Hardcore. And so it feels like it blends together things in that way, and it feels really anthem-like, and it was great to write to it because it's a super angry, song, and it kind of would feel like a good writing mood.
Oh, great. I'm excited. I'm excited for this one. Okay. Roohi Choudhry, thank you so much for being here today. It has really been an absolute pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been wonderful. Such great questions. Thank you so much. And thanks for supporting the book.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.